Hi everyone, my name is Brian King. I'm Assistant City Manager with the City of Irvine. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be at the South Coast Chinese Cultural Association and Irvine Chinese School to talk about districting and expansion. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Justin Levitt here in a minute and Allison with Peppy Smith to talk about our process. But here representing this as a representative of the City of Irvine, just want to thank you for being engaged in this process. It's a really exciting time for the city, going from 5 to 7 council members and applying districts to 6 of those seats. The mayor is obviously going to remain an at-large seat, but the 6 council members will be assigned districts. And so this is designed to get you engaged, to get your feedback, to see how those districts and maps should be applied. And so just really excited. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me or our team. You can also go to the website or call the number, and we're happy to just have you here and be a part of this process. With that, I will turn it over to Allison. Is that okay?
Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Justin and I are going to switch sides so he can man the keyboard. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So just as a reminder that this meeting is being recorded, and we do have translation available if you need it. In the back, you can get some headsets, and through those headsets, Mandarin will speak into them. And we'll also have the Mandarin and English posted on the drawirvine.org website for you to review afterwards as well. And then for the next slide, just as Brian already said, my name is Allie Torres, and I'm Winter Peppy Smith, and then we have Dr. Justin Levitt with National Demographics Corporation, and then, of course, you have your Assistant City Manager, Brian King. And then with that, just a quick overview of why this process is important. You are going to learn from the experts today. National Demographics Corporation and Justin himself has done countless districting and redistricting process. And he has produced many maps. And so you're learning from the experts today on why or how to draw your own map. And then we also get to hear from you on why this process is important and what your feedback and communities of interest are. We're going to turn it over to you at a certain point, and we'll write on the whiteboard what all of your communities of interest are. And those communities of interest can be your neighborhood that you live in. It could be the church that you go to. It could be anything that you find that groups people together in a certain way. And we don't want to split those communities of interest, so we do want you to let us know what you think your neighborhoods and communities are and look like and where they're placed in the city of Irvine. And then we also are going to go through all of the tools. So we'll turn it back, or then Justin will go through what all of the mapping tools that are available to you are. So he'll go through and run through the demo. So in addition to the paper maps that you guys already have, there are multiple powerful online tools that are on the website that Justin will run through. And then last but not least, one of the main reasons why we're here is we want you to feel empowered to draw your own map and be able to be active in this important process. And then with that, we can go to the next slide. And then just some more reasons why this process is important. It is important for residents of their city to be active in the democratic process. And democracy, frankly, works better when people are involved. So by sharing your voice, telling us where your communities are, where your neighborhoods lie, you're able to be an active participant in the democratic process. And then you're also the experts in your community. You know where you grocery shop, you know where your friends live, you know the neighbors next to you. Unfortunately, I don't, but I do want to learn. And so we want to hear from you where your communities lie. And so you are the experts, and you're able to tell us to make sure that we draw maps, or Justin draws maps that are accurate to your communities. And then last but not least, these districts that are going to be drawn in this districting cycle are going to be around for about the next decade, until the next redistricting cycle in 2031. So that means you'll be voting in these districts with these district lines for quite some time. So this is an important process, and therefore we want to make sure that we empower residents to be a part of this process. And then just a quick schedule for today. We will be going until about 4:30. And the agenda, as mentioned, we'll go through the process, the rules, and the goals. We'll also highlight the mapping tools. And then we'll collect your community of feedback interest on that whiteboard. And then you'll be able to see that on the website, drawirvine.org. And then also go through some next steps. So this isn't the only forum that we have. We have many different forums in the process for this districting process. And then we also have several public hearings where council can hear directly from you what you want your communities of interest to be. So be sure to be active as possible in this process, as well as draw as many maps as you want. And all of those maps that you draw will be up for council consideration at the third public hearing. And then with that, I'll pass it over to our expert.
Thank you. And I always like the hearings or these community forums toward the later part of the cycle, because people who do the introductions end up mentioning half the points I intend to mention in the presentation. But I am going to take a step back for a second, because we say these districts will be used, and that's not quite true. I want to emphasize that what we're doing as part of this process is the council has decided to put a charter reform on the ballot in the March 2024 presidential primary election to ask you, the voters, whether you would like to make some changes to Irvine's governing board. In particular, this reform would expand the council from 5 members to 7, institute district elections for 6 members, with the mayor that continued to be elected citywide. And so really, whatever the map is that's introduced or created as part of this process, it will be selected by the council in order to be put on the ballot, but then you, the voters, will have the opportunity to decide whether or not that map will serve Irvine for the rest of this decade. And so that election will be the presidential primary in March of 2024. So let's go on to the next slide. And I want to talk about what we mean by district elections and at-large elections. At-large elections are the way we currently elect members to our council. That means that all 5 members of the council can live anywhere within the city, and all the residents within the city vote for all positions on the council. In fact, I think it's the top 2 vote getters in each election, plus the separately elected mayor. What by district means, what the system the city is looking at switching to is a system like we elect members to Congress, to the state legislature, to the county board of supervisors. And if you live in Irvine Unified School District or Tustin Unified School District, the way you elect members to your school boards as well. It means that the city will be divided into areas. Each member will reside within his or her own area, their own area, and only the voters registered to vote within that part of the city will be able to elect that member to council. Like I said, this is a system used by Congress, state legislatures, and actually, if we go to the next slide, Irvine is now the largest city in the state that does not use by-district elections. In part, it's because the city is growing, and in no small part, it's because many cities throughout the state, over 200 cities in fact, have switched from at-large to by-district elections over the last decade and a half. This map we have on the left shows in 2010, just about every city in the county used at-large elections. Today, only many of the smaller cities, either at the very north or south end of the county, use at-large elections. Most of the biggest cities have switched. Should mention before I leave the slide, there is a third system of elections the state allows. It's called from district. Newport Beach uses it, and Santa Ana used to use it. That was where each representative had to reside within a specific part of the city, but all voters throughout the city could vote for those offices. Now, under state law, that's still technically considered an at-large election. So it doesn't provide that same voter feedback within the district that same connection within the district between the representative and the people who reside in a particular part of the city. Now, this question of whether or not this is a good change for Irvine, this is a little bit beyond the scope of where I want to go right now. So all we're saying is that this choice will be yours. And as we get through the process and pick a final map and put it on the ballot, that conversation is something that we will have as a city between now and the March election. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the districting process. Because essentially, in this process, there are 3 stages. In this first stage, we haven't drawn any maps. We're looking for your input on communities, on neighborhoods. We're trying to spread the word that this process is going on. And as we kind of continue to ramp up our engagement, we continue to ramp up our social media presence, hopefully new people will discover that this process is going on. But we haven't drawn any maps yet, so this is still early days in terms of the mapping process. As part of this round, we held 2 public hearings in April and May in front of the council. And in addition, we held 7 community workshops, including 6 at neighborhood locations and 1 virtual workshop. And that virtual workshop, which is recorded on Zoom and available online, is available to listen to in several different languages. And you can see that on our website, drawirvine.org. This is actually the 6th of 7 workshops we're holding for this particular round. So we still have an additional workshop in 2 weeks. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But before we get there, I want to mention where we're going from here. After we finish this stage of the process, the second stage is discussion of the map. So starting in late June, we have our first deadline. If you're going to submit your own map, our first deadline is June 29th. Following that, we have to release maps no later than July 4th so that we can start the process of discussing those maps on July 11th. We will continue to discuss the maps throughout the summer into the fall. We're going to hold another round of workshops throughout the city in August and September, looking at the draft maps from that first round. We'll have another opportunity to revise maps on October 10th in front of the council. And then following that, on September 12th. And then following that, the council will have its first opportunity to select the final map on October 12th. This gives us time to make sure we get the measure on the ballot and have 6 full months to discuss what these districts and the process of expanding the council before that vote occurs in March of 2024 on the presidential primary. And that's really our third stage, going from the selection and approval of the final ballot language to that vote in March. If voters approve those districts in March, we'll have our first election in those districts in November. In addition, those district lines will be used through the 2030 election. And then in 2031, the city will be asked to look at the districts and see if they still make sense and incorporate new numbers from the US Census of 2030 to redraw the lines, rebalance the districts, and every 10 years after, following the census, the city will have an opportunity to redraw its map. Let's go on to the next slide. This has been our round of first round workshops. We are here today at the South Coast Chinese Cultural Center on May 13th. 2 Saturdays from now, on May 27th, at 10 a.m., we'll be at the Lakeview Senior Center. For those of you who are just finding out or continuing to tell people about this, please advise them. They can come to that meeting. They'll get a very similar presentation and another opportunity to ask questions, provide our feedback, and see the tools being demoed. Go to the next slide. For our second round, this gives you some of our dates for the 7 workshops we're planning on holding for the second round. We will have a virtual workshop in the second round as well. That'll be the night after the council meeting, kind of reviewing what the council decided the previous day. And then we're working from there all the way till after the next public hearing so that we can continue to develop and hear feedback on the maps. It really becomes a dialogue in the second stage as we look at maps and say, this one works because it does blah, blah, blah. This one doesn't work because it doesn't do something in my neighborhood or my community that I think would make sense. And so the schedule of these will be online on drawirvine.org, and we will make sure to get publicity, social media, out as we kind of get into this stage of the process. But you'll definitely have plenty of opportunity to give feedbacks on the maps in October and September. August and September. Now we're taking a look at how we draw the maps. And this slide is really the heart of this presentation in some ways. Maybe it's the most technical part, and that's why we spend a lot of time on it. But this slide gives us the rules we follow when drawing districts. And if you're drawing your own maps, it gives you some guidelines and rules to follow for your own map as well. We've divided them into 3 categories here, 3 columns, representing their relative importance in law. In the left-hand column, federal law, these are criteria the Supreme Court requires us to comply with. And every jurisdiction in the country, from congressional districts all the way down to the smallest school districts, have to follow the criteria in the left-hand column. First and foremost is equal population. This is the one person, one vote principle that the Supreme Court has upheld repeatedly over the last 70 years. This means that districts have to have more or less the same number of total residents. And I say total residents because it includes everybody counted as part of that 2020 census count. It includes children, it includes non-citizens, it includes college students who were staying in the dorms at UCI. Everybody counted as part of that 2020 census count counts toward equal population. So we take that total population number, we'll see it in the future, but just to give you a little bit, it's about 300,000. We're going to divide that by 6 to get our ideal population. Now, each district will not be precisely that population. For everything that's on this slide, the Supreme Court does allow local governments like cities to deviate or have some difference from that perfect number. That deviation or difference from the ideal number cannot be more than 10% total between all of our districts. What that means is that we can go maybe a little bit over, 5% over our ideal population, 5% under our ideal population, and then we add those kind of numbers together to get our total deviation. And we want that total deviation to stay under 10%. But there may be some very good reasons why we don't aim for 0. And everything else on this slide is why we don't aim for 0. Now, in addition, the federal government also requires compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. The Federal Voting Rights, Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, requires us to look at protected class communities, groups that have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration and voting, and make sure that their rights are protected in the districts we draw. This is not simply looking at the numbers and saying, oh, you have enough numbers in this particular area to draw a majority Asian American seat, for example. You must draw it exactly along this line. No, in fact, race cannot be the only factor, or even the predominant factor, justifying a district boundary. What we need to do is consider those protected class communities, and yes, Irvine has some, as we look at all the columns, particularly all the criteria in the second column. We can't intentionally divide a community either, a protected class community either. That's what we often term gerrymandering. When you hear that word, oftentimes it's about making a deliberate choice to do something that doesn't comply with the law or best practices. Okay, now after this first column, the middle column is our California state criteria. This is the Fair Maps Act of 2019. The state of California passed a list of criteria that cities must comply with. And they must comply with them in this order. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, because we have to look at them in that order. First, contiguity. Contiguity is the idea that a district has to have one outside boundary. You can't have a little bit of the district down by the spectrum and another little piece up at the business district and another little piece at the very, by UCI and another little piece way over in a different corner of the city that don't touch each other. You have to be able, as some states have put it, to walk or drive from one part of a district to every other part of that district without leaving the district. So we want to aim for, we actually do have to create maps that do have this one exterior boundary. Next, undivided neighborhoods and communities of interest. This is the heart of the redistricting process. What are the areas that need to be kept together for the purposes of their fair and effective representation? And this is also where we're going to have the most disagreement. Because as I'll discuss in a slide or two, when we talk about communities of interest, we often think of different communities of interest. And I'm not going to say that anybody is wrong when they talk about what they believe is a fair and effective division of a city, because I don't think it's easy to quantify this. When we talk about the shared issues, the shared problems, the shared concerns, people may have different valid ways of linking neighborhoods and communities together. And so we'll talk more about this in a second. But I just want to emphasize this is where 90% of the conversation is going to happen. Afterwards, easily identifiable boundaries. This is the principle that it should be easy for voters to understand where their district boundaries are. So what this means in practice is that we should follow major roads like freeways or multi-lane roads rather than jogging through neighborhoods. But not just major roads. It could be natural features like rivers or canyons. It could also be jurisdictional boundaries. For example, we might use the school district boundary between Irvine and Tustin, or an attendance area boundary between two different high schools, and that might be an easily identifiable boundary. Lastly, compactness, the law defines as not bypassing one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. This is aimed at hooks and fingers and weird lines that are very clearly designed to get to a particular house or building or some sort of weirdness in the shape of the district. Now, these are rank ordered for a reason. If there is a reason for doing that, for example, you're trying to put all the homes along a particular canyon in a district, or keep a community where, at the very north end of the city, for example, there's a couple of communities where there's some unincorporated areas, not part of the city, that kind of reach down into the city, and you're trying to keep the neighborhood together at all possible. Those might be reasons why we have less than compact maps, because these criteria are rank ordered and we should keep communities together first before we worry about compactness. But it is one of the things that we do have to concern ourselves with as we're looking at that last part of the map. Now, the Fair Maps also has a prohibition in it. We cannot take into account partisanship or political affiliation, political party registration, voting patterns as part of the final reason for or against a particular map. So that is an explicit prohibition in the Fair Maps Act. And that's why we don't have partisanship as part of a lot of the data you'll find on our maps online. Now, in the third column, we have other principles that have been recognized by the court. And what I'll say about this is that we have to comply with federal and state law. Everything in the third column is optional. These are things we might use as a tiebreaker between two maps that we believe do an equally good job doing everything in the first two columns. But they have been recognized by the courts as valid to consider, and that's why we put them up here. For example, respecting voters' choices is the principle that the voters of a district or city have elected a council, and that it should be up to voters to decide whether council members continue, rather than using the districting process as a way of targeting a particular sitting council member. Or future population growth. The principle that if we do know a city, part of the city is going to grow very rapidly over the next 10 years, we might underpopulate that region compared to other regions to account for that growth that will occur over the next decade. Now, again, these are optional, and I warn you, especially with population growth, a lot of people like to get into the speculation on, well, I know this development's planned here, and I know this is going to happen here. A lot of cities end up finding out that all of those projects end up canceling each other out over the next decade. And so where people thought the growth would happen ends up maybe having a little bit more than growth on the average, but maybe not as extreme as people thought it would be. And especially we know that the state is doing a lot on more high-density housing in developed urban corridors. So it can be kind of hard to predict over the next decade, but it is something we can consider and use it as a reason for justifying underpopulating or overpopulating a district. Let's go to the next slide. So what do those criteria mean in practice? Well, let's start with equal population. Over here, what we have on this slide is our demographic summary. This is a lot of demographic data, mostly from the census. What's not from the Census Bureau is from the statewide database of registration and voting. It gives us our total population count right on the top. 307,958 people counted in Irvine as part of the 2020 census. We divide that number by 6 to get our target population of 51,326. That means that each district, that's the number you're aiming for. Remember I said we're not going to get exactly to it. So if you're drawing your map and your district is between about 49,000 and about 53,000 people, your district's going to fall within that acceptable range. So that's total population, what we're looking at, that ideal number. We'll go down a couple of boxes. You see we have some racial and ethnic data here, and I want to talk about that citizen voting age population. It's the second box down. Citizen voting age population is what the courts require us to use for our Voting Rights Act analysis. This is the population over the age of 18 with US citizenship. The courts actually like to call this the eligible voter count. And the reason why they use it, rather than say total population or everybody over the age of 18 only, is because when we're talking about newer immigrant groups like Latinos or some Asian American groups, we often see that citizenship rates and the percentage of the population under 18 can look very different when we're looking at the Latino community or the Asian American community compared to, say, the Black or the white community. And so we can see here, Irvine, by total population, the census found it was 50% Asian, but by eligible voters, citizen voting age, it's 38% Asian. So in theory, it could be possible to draw a district that looks like it's majority Asian, but not by citizen voting age population. So that's the real challenge. That's why the courts have actually settled on this eligible voter number. But now I'll say numbers are not destiny, especially as we look at many of the other measures, registration, turnout, and all of these demographics on the right-hand column. Demographics tell us a lot about communities. Perhaps they can illustrate communities that we don't even think about, like where we find high density or lower density living. But numbers are only part of the story. And that's true of the Voting Rights Act as well. They're not a substitute from actually hearing from members of the community, seeing the maps drawn by residents of a particular neighborhood or community. And I can give you many stories where a district that may look like a majority district on paper is not the one preferred by residents of that community. Maybe it is, and in which case, that's a very strong argument that it needs to be drawn in a particular way. But I know I've gotten a lot of questions over these meetings about what about different Asian American groups like Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Indian Americans. And so what we want to hear is about not just looking at this number but actually hearing about where the differences are, where the community boundaries are, to the extent that they cluster around particular locations and streets and facilities like this. Now, we do have a lot of demographic information here. A lot of this, as we'll see on the next couple of slides, can be mapped, and we've gotten a lot of requests to add data to this. As we get these requests in, we've been doing our best to keep up and add what we present online, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. But first, we do our voting rights analysis by plotting out where we see each of these protected class groups throughout the city. Now, the color scheme is that the blue and purple areas are under 35% of that particular group, so on Latino, Asian American, and African American respectively. Areas that are in the pink and yellow are over 65% members of that particular community. And so we see here that there is a slight concentration of Asian Americans north of Interstate 5, particularly in the north end of the city. And that's something that's a neighborhood that we're going to have to pay attention to as part of our analysis as we look at it. It doesn't mean we have to draw any district in any specific way, but it is an area of concern under the Federal Voting Rights Act. We also can't intentionally divide it for only the purpose of dividing a particular community. On the other hand, if you can see the other two Latino and African Americans, we don't see neighborhoods that pop up. That doesn't mean there aren't communities. It doesn't mean there aren't areas of concern. You can still talk about that, especially under communities of interest. Let's go to the next slide. And so what do we mean by neighborhoods and communities of interest? And the law actually uses both words, so we assume they mean something different. Now, the way we like to break this down is that neighborhoods are the smallest building block of our districts. Hopefully, they're small enough that we don't ever have to divide a single neighborhood throughout the city. Now, some people would like to say this particular neighborhood of 40,000, that's a little bit big for a neighborhood in a city of 300,000. We are thinking about things like apartment buildings, condominium complexes, a particular cluster of dorms. Maybe it's a street or a particular development, a particular time and place by a single developer. Maybe it's defined by the fact that properties that touch a particular park or school, maybe as small as an elementary school attendance area. The idea with these is that they have some kind of geographical boundary. We should be able to identify where the boundary is by that geographical feature. The neighborhoods, they're the homes that are in this particular canyon, the homes that are on this particular street. Ideally, these neighborhoods, some of them can be quite big, but ideally, we don't want them to make up the entire district or more. At that point, we're really getting into how can we subdivide that area into more precise neighborhoods? Now, that's important when we talk about neighborhoods because these are kind of our building blocks. What do we build them into? If we go to the next slide, we build them into our communities of interest. And so this is where we are talking about 40,000, 50,000, maybe even right at our ideal population sized areas. These are communities of interest, are areas with shared issues, with shared concerns, shared problems. They're defined by the fact that we can identify that all of these neighborhoods face similar challenges, problems, or a need to be represented by a single member. So for example, a very common one we see is for communities of interest will be attendance areas, especially high school attendance areas, because those tend to be quite large. And that's one potential way of thinking about a community of interest, all the neighborhoods that attend a particular high school. But maybe there's also a major road in that area that's, we've been doing road work on that road for 30 years and we can't seem to fix all the problems on that road. And it's not quite the same boundary as that attendance area. Maybe there's a good overlap, but there's some areas that attend the high school that are not affected by the traffic on this road. That could be a different community of interest. Maybe there's some areas that all share a high student population. And they're somewhat different from the high school attendance area. Maybe they're affected by some parts of it are affected by the road. Well, we've got a third community of interest. We can disagree on communities of interest. In fact, we probably will disagree on communities of interest because this is where we need to have our discussion. What communities of interest are most important and most relevant, specifically talking about city government? So one potential thing we looked at is, the attendance areas are often a very big deal for school districts. And school districts will often prioritize attendance areas over just about everything else. But for a city, they kind of rank somewhere on the lower end oftentimes. Not always, but oftentimes. Why? Because cities have other issues that we also are thinking about that school districts don't. A school district may not care that the businesses along the major road want to stay in the same district so they have one representative to represent the business corridor. A city might very much care about that. A school district may not care that there's issues with parks in a particular section of the city. A city may very well care and want to keep the areas affected by a specific park, by a specific natural feature like a river or canyon, or wild space, open space in a single district. We get this a lot because we got our planning areas, and if you go to the next slide, or let's just go one more for now. We're going to come back to that. We actually have planning areas here in the city of Irvine that range in population from under 1,000 people to over 40,000 people. And so some of the smaller ones may very well be neighborhoods, but we have some questions, and this is a question we're going to be posing to you. What happens when we get to one of our 40,000 person neighborhoods and it's really hard to keep that neighborhood together because it's so large? And its impact on all of its neighbors means keeping that neighborhood together would be dividing several other planning areas. Now, go back a slide. One more. Part of this process then becomes a second question. When we think about certain communities, how do we decide if we have to split communities, which ones are best served by being divided? It may be as easy as, actually, on this issue, having 2 or 3 council members that really care about this concern is useful for getting something done. Because you need 4 votes on the council in order to get anything done. So having 3 members or 4 members that really are directly concerned by a particular issue may help that neighborhood get the support it needs or get that, then get the issue solved. And that's going to be something we want to think about as we look at where it makes sense to bridge or divide communities. If we go to the next slide, part of what we look at here are the numbers. They tell us some very interesting things about the city. And you can go to drawirvine.org and look at all of these maps, and most of those demographics that we have on the table are on our interactive web viewer. So that you can take a look and see which parts of the city do we have more children at home, which parts of the city do we have higher density. And like I said, we're adding things to this map all the time. One of the council members requested us to look at areas that, instead of using 75,000, areas that have 200,000 or more as their household income. And so that's something that we're adding to the website, so that we show both the 75,000 map as well as the 200,000 and over map. Density is something that somebody requested at one of our first community workshops, and now that's on our interactive web viewer. So we can definitely continue to expand our data gathering as part of this process. Some of the data that we are looking at from the city, we have gotten a lot of information about the planning areas and villages, the school districts, the homeowners associations, the land use and planning. And the more we need to get, we will look into getting it as much as possible. If you have your own maps of things that we need to look at, we had somebody in a neighboring city bring in an air quality map. That is something that we would love to get and love to put as part of our considerations in drawing district boundaries. And so that really brings us to the website and the tools. And I just want to start by I want to start by emphasizing that we want to hear from you however you want to provide your feedback. If you want to come to the council meeting or one of these forums and speak verbally and that's it, perfect. We'll take your comments down. We'll make sure council sees them. If you want to email us just with your written comments, perfect. We'll take that and maybe put it, as part of our participation or outreach packets that the council gets for each meeting. If you draw any kind of map, single district all the way up to a full district map, even better. We'll draw them in and we'll make sure that the council is able to view and look at them. And we love single district or just partial city maps because maybe you feel very comfortable drawing a district in your own part of the city, but not elsewhere, not in a different part of the city. Or maybe you see that there's somebody else's map out there that looks pretty good on a lot of issues, but doesn't quite get your community rights. And you want to make modifications to it. Tell us what to draw. Tell us how you would like to see those changes. And we'll get all of that feedback processed, and it'll be part of the information that the council and the public has as we review maps. And let's flip over to the website now, because a lot of this information that I'm talking about, our go-to source is drawirvine.org. Drawirvine.org is our one-stop shop for everything to do with the mapping process. We have a schedule on here under the schedule tab, whereas we have our public comments or information about each hearing. We translate all of the press releases, and we have information that you can print out, you can forward on, you can share any of the press releases or other information from here. As the process goes on, this is where we update with additional meetings, additional events that are coming up. I believe our communications packets go on here too, our public comment packets are placed here as well. Next, on the next tab, our draft maps tab. This is where draft maps will go. Now, state law doesn't really like us to post maps before we get through this first stage of the process. But as soon as we get through, and we're kind of starting to ramp up this now, as we draw in the draft maps that we've received, and we've gotten about 9 so far, we're going to be putting them onto the drafts map page here. We will post your original submission, whatever your email or paper map, if you decide to submit it by paper. We'll post it here, and alongside we'll post a standardized version so that we can compare every map side by side. Now, I get this question a lot. What if I submit a map and it's not legal? Well, the first thing is, if you submit a map that isn't legal, we'll still draw it in and we'll still post it. So, because that's still part of our conversation about communities of interest and neighborhoods. In fact, we often get, and we've gotten one so far, where somebody submitted a map that said, I know it's not legal, I still want it to be drawn in. And we can do that, and we will do that, because that's still part of our conversation that we have about what those lines should be. Maybe that map that's not legal serves as a jumping off point for somebody else. That's the idea. In addition to that, we also have our draw map tool. Now, I want to start by the interactive web viewer, because the interactive review map is where we're going to be posting all of the draft maps as they are produced, as well as all of our demographic information as we go through the process. So this is like Google Maps. It's easy to zoom in, zoom out, to search. This is not a map drawing tool. This is a map viewing tool. And because it's a viewing tool, we can show so much more information than we can on any sort of draw your own mapping tool. If you zoom in, and to the point where these gray out, they become black, you can click any of those, and you can see the thematics. So this is % African American. Let's do one like that, speaks other language at home. Turn off the black layer. Okay. Let's just turn off that one and go like % multifamily housing. You can put these on, you get the same color scheme that we had in the maps earlier. So the purples are under 25%, the pinks are over 75%. In this case, multifamily housing. We're looking at where do we see apartment buildings, where do we see higher density housing. In fact, and so as we're adding layers here, we add more information to this map. You can turn on and off the different layers to see more information. And like I said, we're going to put all of the maps on here as we draw in the publicly submitted draft maps, the consultant drawn draft maps, and then you'll be able to overlay those maps over all of these demographics if you wanted to see them. Each map will, of course, have a demographic spreadsheet with it that gives you those numbers for each district. Okay. If we go back to the website, now let's say you do want to draw your own map. The Draw Map section does provide a couple of different ways for you to do that. Perhaps the most straightforward way, which we have available here, are these one-page paper maps. What these paper maps have is the city's divided into about 150 areas. These areas are just based on where we think there are natural divisions on the census blocks. So they're just collections of census blocks. They don't mean anything specific. They're not precincts. They're not unbreakable. They're just areas that we think provide detailed enough information that if you wanted to start pulling out your phone and get out the calculator app, you could create your districts using just the total populations alone, knowing the city. This is actually available in print or as PDF in 8 different languages, ranging from Farsi and Mandarin Chinese to Japanese, Korean, Spanish, and English. As a result of a request from members of the community, we also have a one-page PDF showing the neighborhoods. These are the planning areas, I should say, not neighborhoods, that's a technical term. These are the planning areas. And so for each planning area, we give its approximate total population. I'm going to emphasize the approximate on here because census blocks and planning areas don't always share a boundary. And so what we've had to do is to draw in the map, align it with the census blocks because we have to follow the census blocks to the extent possible in this process. But this does give you a good idea of the populations of the different planning areas. Most of these planning areas are the same as the villages. There are a couple of villages that are smaller than the planning areas. Some planning areas may have 2 villages, but these are the official city planning areas. You have a question about this?
Do you have a copy of that?
Oh, I got a question about where we can get copies. We do have them on the back today, on the table. I believe they're in the back next to the the thing with the highlighters and pens. In addition, it's available on the city website where we created a planning area map. It's available as a PDF on the Draw Map page. Now, lastly, I want to talk about Dave's redistricting, because for those of you who were like, I really want to get into the block level detail and actually see where the census blocks are, there's really no substitute for Dave's redistricting. Now, DRA, or Dave's redistricting, we'll abbreviate it DRA, is a browser-based tool. I recommend using a computer or tablet. It'll be really hard to see anything on your phone. So you'll need a computer or tablet to really get the most out of it. But what it does is offers that ability to really dive down into the block level detail. On the city's website, we give you the link to both where you can create your own account, as well as instructions for how to draw the map. I want to note that we do have 2 videos on the website that go through the process of using Dave's redistricting step by step. One is a 5-minute overview, the other is 15 minutes in more detail. Now, the way to start with Dave's is to go to register for an account. Now, the reason to register for an account is because it gives you the opportunity to save your map in the browser, to share your map with others, and when people share maps with you, you can also create copies, edit that, modify that, etc. So the Dave's redistricting tool allows you to a lot of the functionality of having a program to draw maps on your browser. So the way you log in the upper corner, see that little face icon there? This is where it will be the login or sign up for an account. That's where you'll start. Now here I'm already logged in. So once you've done that, you go back to the website and you click on the template. We've created an Irvine template for the city of Irvine. It will take a few seconds to load because it's loading a lot of information. Irvine's a big city. It will automatically eventually zoom itself in, or should zoom itself in to the city. We've actually added the planning area boundaries on Dave's redistricting for you. Now, we got some questions but these are the official planning areas in black, and underlying that in red are the precincts. Now, the thing you'll do is once you're logged in, you've clicked on the template. All you need to do is go where it says view only, kind of in the upper middle there. Click that paintbrush next to it. Clicking the paintbrush next to it will duplicate the map, and you'll get it onto your list of maps. Now, we're waiting for ours because, we've already have some from previous workshops. You can have as many copies of this map as you want. And once it appears, you can double-click it, and it'll come up on the map as well. And the first thing I like to do is go to the side here and make sure the map overlay is on. The map overlay gives you roads, it gives you buildings as you zoom in, it gives you the names of the cities and the communities within them. Now, to get started once you've done this, I also like to turn on, where it says labels, the total population. And hit apply. That just gives you the total population so you visually can see how many people are in each area. Now let's zoom into a random area. To start drawing, right on top there where you copied the map, you now see that there's a little paintbrush tool again. You click the paintbrush tool, and then you select a district. So let's modify District 1. Now, by default, you're using precincts, and precincts are great if you're moving a large area. So let's move this entire precinct, and the one just above it, the 920 population. Let's move that into a district. That's a few census blocks that have already been merged together for you, and if you know that whole area is going into your district, we just use the precincts to make it easier. But let's say you're trying to now add a few people, and you want to put this golf course in here, but you don't want to put the building next to it in there. And so you want to see if there's a census block, different boundary that you can use. On top there, next to the paintbrush, if we go a little bit to the right, next to precincts, we can choose block. Select block and then select the precinct that you want to divide. And what it will do is divide it into its census blocks. You can then hit individual census blocks, let's click on these two, and move just those census blocks into your target district. Now, unfortunately, there's no block boundary here, so we know that in the future we can't put that boundary exactly where we intended it, but we're going to see if we can still use this road as a boundary. And what you also see here, which is a great illustration of this, you see this tiny block here that goes all along there? That's just one of those realities. It's probably the width of the road. It has its own block. When we're done modifying those blocks, all we need to do is hit precinct. And it'll merge all of those blocks together along that precinct boundary, and then we can select precincts again. Now we do this until we're done, and it's going to take a while because you're going to be looking at all this detail, zooming in and out, panning around the map. When you're ready to go, we go back to, on the upper left-hand corner, next to where it says DRA 2020, that little 3 bars, hit that and go to Maps. This takes us back to our list of maps. It automatically saves everything you've done up to that point. When you're ready to submit, click the box next to the map, and then you'll see this new toolbar appears. You go to Share, and this gives you the opportunity to do several things. Copying this URL, which you can do there. You can put this into an email to us and submit your map this way, probably the best. If you are working with people, you can select Allow Editing and send the email to somebody else. They can then open it up and modify the map, and you can collaborate on a map. Remember to turn that off before you send in your final map to us. You can also, if we go to Dismiss, you can also duplicate your map here. Duplicating your map just allows you to make another copy of it so that you can, say, have your map 1A and map 1B and map 1C. And you can have 8 different maps that have 2 census blocks that vary between them. Believe me, we see that all the time. And if you do that, we're going to ask you to pick your favorite map. This is kind of where you'll go back to as your list of maps. You can double-click any map on that list. Like, let's double-click our map, and it'll take you right back to where we left off. So you'll be able to start editing, do it again. This is the advantage of having an account on Dave's Redistricting. And really, thank you to Allie. Let's all give Allie a round of applause for doing this. These are the basic skills you'll need on Dave's. But where do you send this, or where do you send this map if you're doing a paper map? Well, let's go back to the website. The website will remind you that everything can be submitted to districting@cityofirvine.org. In fact, if you're using the paper map, it'll remind you on the paper map that districting@cityofirvine.org is our address, email address, for you to send your comments, your feedback, your draft maps, anything you want to send us. If you go to our contact page, it'll take you right to districting@cityofirvine.org. So that's our best one-stop shop for anything you want to submit in writing or electronically. There also are additional resources on the website if you want to know more about the districting process or anything like that. And like I said, we continue to add and update the website daily based on the feedback we get. So let's hop back over to the presentation. We just have a couple more things to talk about before, before we get to those last couple things. Now it's really our time for question and answers, and because we are filming, may repeat your question or need to repeat your question. Let's start with the Q&A, and then we'll move into communities of interest if there are no questions. So, any questions about redistricting, about the process? I see one.
How does Irvine compare with other cities in terms of at-large seats?
How does the number?
Does Irvine get the 51,000 for district
How does Irvine compare to other cities when it comes to the number of people per district with 6 districts and 51,000? That's an interesting question because the number of people per seat is highly dependent on the total population of a city. I would say that, we have seen in the last few years, cities the size of Irvine are generally at 7 council members. So Anaheim and Orange, for example, both expanded from 5 to 7 when they switched to district elections. So did Costa Mesa. Santa Ana was already at 7, so they kept their 7-member council. I say these are all 6 plus 1, technically, 6 council members plus a citywide mayor. Most at-large cities have 5. Most general law cities have 5 because that's the default in state law. Now, the larger cities in the state, San Diego, for example, has 9 council members. So they actually have 150,000 people approximately. I think a little bit larger, maybe 100 and, I know it was 143 10 years ago. I know it's a little bit bigger then. Los Angeles has over 200,000 people per council district, and they have 15 members. San Francisco is 11 members. I believe they're at about 75, 80,000 people. But we are looking at those kind of big cities. And so cities about 300,000. Anaheim and Santa Ana are both at about 400,000. And they both have 7 members. So I would say that a lot of cities in the 200 to 400,000 range really are at that 7-member council size, and that's. But of course, there's a lot of variation. But you could see a lot of million-person cities, San Diego, San Jose, they both have 9-member councils, and they're at over 1 million people. So those are going to be much more people per district. The smallest. I'll just for fun, there's the city of Bradbury, 252 people, has a 5-member council, so 50 people per district. They actually have one apartment building that has to be divided between 2 districts to get that 50 people per district. So I would say that Irvine moving to 7 puts it in line with other cities of a similar size. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
No.
There have been a few maps so far that have been submitted that have discontinuity errors or potential discontinuity errors, but the errors are close enough that with technical corrections, they could be remedied. For example, there's a couple maps that have been submitted that are discontiguous because they're just two diagonal corners of an intersection. But if you were to add like the median of the road, it would be contiguous.
Yeah.
Will NBC be making those sorts of technical corrections?
Okay, so the question is, there are a few maps that have been submitted or may be submitted in the future with discontiguity at a point. Maybe because they're going kind of catty corner across 2 different neighborhoods or across the freeway. You could make them technically contiguous by putting the road or the freeway in them. As we saw on the Dave's redistricting, there are a lot of roads that are census block wide that might work for that. I think what we're going to do with those is we're not going to call them out as, we are going to make we definitely make technical corrections for people, especially who use the Dave's redistricting tool and miss a census block or misassign a census block. If they don't rise to the level of serious issues, we do help people with the technical corrections. And I know we have a paper map that does that where it's unclear, but you could make it contiguous. We will note that they're technically contiguous, but not necessarily what I'll say is we will note it. What you cannot have, and I haven't seen a map that does this yet, but it's possible, is if it's catty corner contiguous in both directions only, that's not legal. You have to, if you do have one catty corner district, we can note it as it's technically contiguous, but And we do think that it's possible it could survive legal challenges that way. But that is something that the council will have to decide whether they're comfortable with. But it's a really good question, because we're going to be drawing, we've already been talking about that issue behind the scenes. Yeah.
Back to the slide of the projected groups and such.
Yeah.
Are all of those right Latinx, Asian American, African American, are they all categorized by census like survey?
So all of those numbers are from the census, from the American Community Survey. Oh, so the question was on the slide with the maps of the different protected class communities. Where are they from? Where are the data from?
Are they categorized under like survey, for example?
Oh, how are they categorized? Okay, yeah. So that's a good question. And so I'll say they are from the census. They are part of the American Community Survey. It's all self-reported data. The Department of Justice asks the Census Bureau, basically forces the Census Bureau, to do a particular way of treating that data that aligns with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so what they do is they divide the population. It's all self-reported, so it's all people who get the form, whatever they marked is what goes in there. If you mark more than one race, there's a formula for how they figure out how to categorize it. If you report something that's not on the list, they can also move you depending on, it gets very technical at that point. But I'm happy to talk about it more after the meeting. But this is it is self-reported data, and it's based on the way the Department of Justice requires that data to be processed. And we just get it right from it's the special tabulation is what they call it. Any other questions? It's actually an update of the data set the state uses. The state just hasn't updated theirs. They still have the old 2019 data because that was what we used in the 2021 redistricting. And we've got next year of data at this point. Actually, 2 years later at this point. Yeah.
Since you have all the knowledge to how to divide each district with the population to be equally, it's possible you guys experts to provide some kind of sample in that for people to take a look at this reasoning.
Well, okay, so the question is, if NDC is the expert, could we provide some sample maps for us to do just based on our knowledge of the data? And I'll say two things. First of all is, we will be doing that. The state requires we have our first 2 public hearings before we produce any maps. And so this is we had our second public hearing on Tuesday. And we wanted to make sure to have these workshops and forums without maps present so that we can hear from you about your communities of interest. We will create those maps following this round of hearings. Because this brings me to the second point. Especially when we talk about neighborhoods and communities of interest, we have 100 million different ways of drawing the maps. I mean, if there are 5,000 census blocks in Irvine, there are literally over 1 million ways to draw the map. A lot of those ways make absolutely no sense. And so what we rely on is not just the numbers. We rely on hearing from you about where our starting point should be. Where are the neighborhoods and communities that absolutely need to be kept together, that absolutely need to be respected? Should we focus on this type of community or that type of community? And when I say this or that, I mean like planning areas and villages, or do we focus more on demographic information, which may not align with the planning areas or villages? And we're going to put in front of you, by the July 11th hearing, all of the community maps and additional maps, maybe 2 or 3 maps, depending on what we hear, depending on what we need to do, that illustrate some of those choices or decisions. And that really is the second round of hearings, when we look at all those maps and say, I know that you use demography to do this map, but it's clear you don't know where our community boundaries are. Or, I know you use demography, and that's a really interesting line. I never would have thought to put a line there, but it actually makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. And we've had every reaction from get rid of the consultant map because it doesn't make any sense, to like, wow, we were torn between these two maps and you figured out a way to merge them together to make the best map possible. And sometimes it's and then I'll say, like, sometimes it is a real process, and we're going to have a lot of feedback, a lot of hearings, a lot of workshops before we reach that final map. But we will come up with some draft maps following these workshops. And I'll say we used to actually start the process by putting out a couple maps, and the state put in a requirement saying that we have to have these hearings before we have specific draft maps. Now, we're going to turn it over to our section on your communities, where we want to hear from you about what your communities are. So I'm going to turn this over to Allie to introduce our questions.
So we have roughly about 15 minutes, and we wanted to make sure that we spend as much time as possible collecting your communities of interest, since this is why we asked you all to be here, as well as learn about the process. So on the screen here, we have a couple of questions to just prompt you with ways that you can identify your communities of interest. And so I'll give it a few seconds as you read through, but as you do read through, I'm going to just provide an example of what we've heard from past workshops. At one of the past workshops, they told, or our attendees told us that one community of interest are actually the fire district zones. So where fires and wildfires could be very prominent and be a risk for those communities. So for example, like the communities that are up in the hills. So that's just one example. You could also use like the villages. So for example, like Woodbridge, if you want to like identify that. But these are just some questions to help you identify what your possible community of interest could be.
And because we heard a lot of this on Tuesday, we've heard a lot about UCI and neighborhoods with a lot of college students, a lot of mini dorms down around UCI. And one of the questions we actually got last set of workshops we did was about UCI versus or alongside some of the other colleges within the city of Irvine. Is there a community of interest between UCI and the community college, Irvine Valley College, or between Concordia or some of the other universities within the city? These may be some of the trade-offs that we explore through the map. But this list of questions we have here really is a good starting point for thinking about how would you answer them for your community? Or how would you use this question to determine where your community is? So that fire question, what is significant about the physical environment? The university, maybe that's part of our work-related traits or common concerns that groups of people have over things like affordable housing or transportation.
Thanks, Justin. And so I'll open it up to you guys. If you guys have any communities of interest, we're going to just note it down here on the screen, and then that will be posted to the drawirvine.org website. So looking towards you guys to see if you have any communities of interest to add to this list that we have going on our website here.
I think the obvious are the neighborhoods, I think Northwood, for example, versus the Great Park. That's obvious, but I think I live along the Menta Spur Trail, so community interest kind of probably homes along the trail that probably have more impact to maybe its development, etc.
And I think you raised a great thing there. If there are boundaries, like a line you shouldn't cross, that can be something we want to put up here as well.
Sorry, if you could repeat your trail one more time.
The Menta Spur Trail is in Northwood. So I guess homes that live along the trail.
Okay.
Maybe have more of, maybe that would be a community of interest.
Yeah, so wherever
I'm
it
interested in.
makes sense. Yeah, I think we might need.
Menta Spur, SPUR.
Perfect. Thank you. That's perfect. So wherever you're able to just clearly identify boundaries is always a great way to also identify your communities of interest. So those are 3 great ones so far. And looking towards the rest of our attendees here, any additional communities of interest, whether that's highlighting just areas that you would like to stay together in a specific district, or if, for example, we've also gotten like certain like commercial areas where there may not be a ton of housing. Like those could be communities of interest, or where there are some housing in commercial areas. Those housing areas need to stay as a community of interest. These are just some examples for you to consider as you begin thinking of communities of interest.
So I have another one. I think there was a map that was shown on the HOAs. There is a section of, I guess, there's certain pockets within Irvine that does not have HOAs. So I guess that's a map that I'm interested in seeing it
Yeah.
where that lie, because of course, development and in those areas may
Look a little
more
different.
where there are HOAs.
Yeah, definitely. Irvine is full of HOAs. So where there's not an HOA, that's a little unusual. But
Yeah. And a lot of that is actually interesting because that's where we see mostly the apartments and some condominium type complexes, the higher density divisions.
Actually, no, there are older areas within Irvine, like let's say across the Willows, across from Irvine High School. That area
Perfect.
doesn't have HOA, and then just the older areas within Irvine, and not necessarily, I guess you were saying multi-apartments, not necessarily have the more older neighborhoods.
perfect. Yeah, thanks for identifying a school as well. That's always helpful. And then I saw a hand back there as well.
Yeah, just kind of, I've been many of these.
Yes, we're friends at this point.
You're a Irvine student. I think the general consensus among at least a lot of the students that I've spoken to is that we want to keep a district that has UC Irvine west of Clover and Phoenix
Okay.
Canyon.
Perfect.
That is,
Yeah.
a clear dividing line as far as we see it. The campus stops at Clover. Turtle Rock, all of the houses face away from the campus. There's like a giant chasm there where there's like nothing in that stretch of road. Once you get south of campus, there's, the university faces towards the university, Culver faces towards Culver. There's a clear dividing line there. And so, while it would be nice to have, us with our fellow campuses, I think it would do more harm than good to pair us, say, with Concordia, which is the closest other campus to the university, because that would require either splitting up Turtle Rock, which is not in their, which hurts their interest, or would require adding Turtle Rock with the university, which you all heard on Tuesday is fundamentally dissimilar from the university. They have, a lot of areas there with the income where a lot of people make over $200,000, which is why I imagine they'll have been asked to make a map of that. Whereas around a third of the students on campus live below the poverty line. So there's a huge disparity there. So ideally, we would not have any portions of Turtle Rock with UC Irvine. We would use Culver and Community Canyon as the dividing line, which is recognizable to all South Irvine residents. That was at hope. It might be worth looking into potentially pairing Concordia and IBC. That is doable population-wise, but I'm not from either of those campuses, so I don't want to speak for them.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And anyone else have a community that they would like to note or neighborhood they would like to note? Yes.
I don't know where they are exactly, like where they lie, but there are mobile home areas. I would like to make sure that they're still kept together.
Yeah, definitely. And we have those on maps already, so those are pretty easy for us to identify as well. Awesome. Sorry, go ahead, Justin. Okay.
Question about protected classes, and on the one hand, you that you need protected classes, and then on another hand, you said it's against the Voting Rights Act and gerrymandering. So kind of want to understand maybe more clarity on that. And I mean,
Sure.
and then there's been some
So-
emphasis on culture and what like ethnicities, and so you kind of I'm kind of
Sure.
confused on that.
What does the Voting Rights Act actually require when it comes to protected class communities? That is actually a really important question. It's a really difficult one, actually, because the Supreme Court has on one hand said very explicitly, race cannot be the only reason why you draw a district in a particular way. On the other hand, it has said you do have to consider race and ethnicity, but specifically using the language of protected class communities, groups that they define, have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration and voting when you draw districts. And so the best guidance we can really think about here is really using communities of interest first to understand what properties, what concerns, what issues really unite that community. Because oftentimes when we're talking about a neighborhood or an area that's predominantly of a particular ethnic group or racial group, it's not just the ethnicity or race that defines the neighborhood. Maybe it's often, there's also other features that define what that neighborhood is, what it looks like, what its issues are, what its problems are. And what the court is asking us to do is identify what other issues unite that area. Maybe it's the schools, maybe it's the businesses, maybe it's the religion, maybe it's the issues with representation in other levels of government. Maybe, I'm throwing out things here because, maybe sometimes we even look at the demographics and see, well, compared to other neighborhoods, this neighborhood has a higher share of new development, of mobile homes, of working class residents compared to middle class or upper class residents. We're looking for those features that define that neighborhood beyond just, well, we put all these voters together because they're all black. That's what the courts have asked us to do. And so what we're looking at, the courts do require us to do an analysis that says, hey, look, you could draw a majority black district here. I'm using black here. You couldn't draw a majority African-American district in the city of Irvine, but just as an example. They didn't like maps in the 90s that were drawn that were basically take this black neighborhood here and this black neighborhood 300 miles away, put them together with the rope the length of a highway, and call that a district, a majority black district. They said that's not good enough under the Voting Rights Act. There's no community, there's no issue, there's not enough of a community connection there. You need to find what that community connection is beyond just simply saying, oh, we're putting all the African Americans in the same district. That's what we're trying, that's what we need to do here. It's not good enough under the Federal Voting Rights Act to just say, oh, look, there's some Asians in the north end of the city, we're gonna create a majority Asian district. We need to understand, is there other issues that link those areas together? Is there something that ties that together as a community? Whether it's religion, whether it's demographics, whether it's schools, whether it's planning areas, whether, I'm listing a whole bunch of different things. But that's what we need to do as we're trying to identify how best to serve that community. And it may be the case that simply saying, oh, look, hey, there's a majority area is actually not what that community wants, what the people living in that area want. For example, like when we worked with the neighboring city of Anaheim, our city up the road, Anaheim, their residents said very clearly, like, no, there's different neighborhoods here. And even though we're not getting exactly 51% or 50% majority Latino districts, it's better to keep all of this community together and separate them from this other very distinct community than it is to draw an arbitrary district to link them. And so that's what we have to do as part of this process. focus on community and what ties communities together first. And then let's take a look at the Voting Rights Act when we have that district, the districts that you've drawn, and say, well, it doesn't get, this district actually does represent communities, and it has an Asian majority district. So I think that's a really good thing. This other one, we think it does a pretty good job on communities, but it doesn't have a majority Asian district. Maybe that's a little bit weaker. Especially if it looks like it's dividing right through the Asian community. That could be a reason for rejecting that map. And so like I said, this is not a simple question. And it's a question that legal lawyers have been arguing about since the Supreme Court in 1993 said, race cannot be the only factor when you draw a district. But that's my best way of interpreting that.
Thank you. And then with that, unless there's any final communities of interest that we'd like to note here for this workshop, then we'll go ahead and move to, the next upcoming workshops and the next steps in the process here. So as mentioned in the first couple of slides, we do have 2 rounds of workshops. And so this is the second to last one of the first round. The last one of the first round will be on May 27th at 10 a.m. at the Lakeview Senior Center. And so, as Justin mentioned, most of these presentations for the first round are going to look relatively the same, but the conversation that happens is always different. There's different questions that's asked, there's different communities of interest that are given, and so you're encouraged to attend the last one of the first round, and then if you want to attend all of them for the second round, we welcome it. And here are the second round workshops. They do start up again in July, so we do take a little bit of a hiatus in terms of the workshops, but we do have some pop-ups. So you'll see us around. We saw our friend Brian here earlier today, and we told him to come. So we were able to, so we'll be around the town, just at different places as well. And so you will be able to reach out to us for different questions and be able to tell us your communities of interest at all of those events as well. And then just a last couple of items here, as we, I think, have, put the nail in the coffin on what our website is. It's drawirvine.org, and we will take any additional communities of interest. If you would like to submit an email, or if you would like to give us a phone call, we will take those voicemails as well and post those on the drawirvine.org website in order for those to be public comment. And any communities of interest that you submit over email will be put into consideration for when Justin draws the maps from NDC. And at that point, Justin, if you want to give any final words, but that will wrap us up for today.
I'll just close by thanking you all for coming today, and thank you to our interpreters, our video recorder, and Brian King from the city of Irvine, and thank you to Trepepi Smith for running the workshop. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
I know.